Hello, my name is Jim Alatris. I'm the president of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I'm glad you could all join us here today. And we're delighted to have Madhuri Kommareddi, who is the Director of Workforce Development for Governor Andrew Cuomo. And she has a critically important job because we're trying to solve the problem of how do we train the current workforce that we have and then the future workforce we have in New York State especially. We've done a lot of work at the Institute, and one troubling stat I always like to use because there's an opportunity in that. When it comes to AI, something we're very heavy into here, looking at automation and AI, we could literally lose 53% of the current employment that we have in New York State. It's not that we're losing those jobs, but those jobs are dramatically shifting to other types of fields. The question becomes, can we actually train the workforce that we have to meet those job expectations, or run into what we're running into now, which is in some cases importing folks to come into New York to meet our job needs. We have about 300,000 unfilled jobs in the state, half of which are low-wage jobs that folks, quite frankly, don't want. And we're not going to get into the immigration debate and those things, but they're often filled in other ways, and we're running the problem there. The other half, we have skills gaps where we're not meeting our workforce demand. So this issue and this position is critically important. Madhuri has to actually pull all of these disparate pieces that we have in New York State together to come up with a comprehensive, cohesive vision. And just as a little background, before she got here as the Director of Workforce Development, she was the Director of Investment Relations at BlackRock. She's had positions at the Clinton Foundation. She's worked for Secretary Clinton. She served as the Director for International Economic Affairs at the White House National Security Council and National Economic Council, as well as many other positions. So she really is a phenomenal person who is really the person to run workforce for the state of New York. We're thrilled to have her. Madhuri Kommareddi, please come up. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for the Rockefeller Institute for having me today. I'm really excited to speak to you about the vision for workforce development that Governor Cuomo has laid out. I'll spend about 15 or 20 minutes speaking about kind of what's the employment context that we're in today. I'll talk you through the different things that the state is taking on to really address this workforce challenge. I'll do a little bit of a deep dive into one of the elements of our approach and strategy, the funding, because I know that's what a lot of you, as I look across the room, have come to me and asked me about. And then we'll open it up to your questions, which will be, I think, exciting. So really hoping that this is kind of a collaborative conversation, because I think Jim kind of nailed really well some of the challenges that we're facing as a state and as an economy today. So let me take you through first. Good. So usually I'm pretty bad with these clickers, so this is like a good sign. Let me first take you through some important statistics about what's happening with our labor market today, because I think that'll really frame for you the vision that the governor's laid out and what we're trying to do from a state government perspective. So we have kind of a twin set of occurrences happening right now. The top set of facts that I have on the screen really talks to you about the positive and where we are with our tremendous economic growth over the past 10 years that is continuing. And then at the bottom half, it's not just bad kind of formatting. The space is there for a reason. The second half is really going to talk about what are the structural challenges that we're facing as an economy and as a society. So let me start with where we are cyclically and what's happening kind of in an exciting perspective in New York State. So one, unemployment is in many cases at historic lows across the state. Across the state in April, it was 3.9%. We have a tremendous number of private sector jobs in New York State, 8.3 million. And through the REDC process, the Regional Economic Development Council process that Governor Cuomo launched about 8 years ago, we've had tremendous investment across the state, which really is seeing a lot of impact, which is positive for a lot of communities, not only urban, suburban, but rural as well. And I was just sharing with some of my colleagues earlier, I have now been to all 10 of our economic development regions, and it's been great to kind of see up close how this tremendous economic growth has been kind of shared across the state. Jim had mentioned the number of job openings that are unfilled that we have today. Let's put that in context. Over the next 10 years, we're expecting a similar number of job openings to be occurring, about 360,000 every year over the next 10 years, which is a pretty tremendous set of figures given the state's population. So in sum, we are at an amazing point after 10 years of economic growth. We're seeing shared prosperity increase across the state, and we're seeing a real demand for jobs today. But let's put this into a little bit of the context of where we know the future is going to be. One is that when we look at the sectors of where job growth has been hottest, healthcare, which won't be a surprise for many of you, education, and retail, we're also seeing, though, that retail is having actually shrinking jobs. And a lot of these jobs are low wage and also high churn, because as Jim mentioned earlier when he introduced me, that these low skill, high churn jobs are not jobs that people want. So as soon as they find something else, they're going to. So that's kind of the challenge that we have, is that growing low-wage jobs and some of these sectors with AI, with automation, the gig economy, we're seeing a fundamental restructuring of how jobs are being created as well, which doesn't, though, just affect New York State. This is a national problem. This is also a global problem. So in my last job, I was working in the private sector at a global financial services company. We were facing this job globally, or facing this challenge globally, where it wasn't just kind of constrained job growth in New York City, where the company was headquartered, but also in other parts of the United States, in Europe, in Asia as well. So truly, when we talk about some of these challenges, which are not just automation, but also the gig economy, kind of the decoupling of full-time work, this is a global challenge that we're facing. And then the last thing I think that is really important to kind of set the context to about where the economy is today is that even within New York State, we have a lot of different pictures depending on what community you're in. So for example, we have significantly higher unemployment rates within certain minority populations in Buffalo, in Rochester, Syracuse, and of course, New York City as well. Also, when you look at other demographic trends, whether it's individuals with disabilities, immigrants, refugees, we also see different economic pictures, which means that as much as we've had a tremendously growing economy for 10 years, we have not had fully even growth, particularly in terms of getting those middle skill, higher wage jobs. So against that backdrop, I'm now going to talk to you about the kind of three elements that Governor Cuomo has laid out as our priorities for workforce development through the state. And these are more kind of almost the process of how we're really going to be tackling this issue, and slightly less into the substance. I'll get into the substance in a few minutes. But let me take you through kind of what the overall vision is. So again, we have this near-term challenge that we have more jobs than we can fill. I've had employers come up to me across the state saying that they're worried that they're going to have to turn away business because they don't have the skilled workers to meet their economic needs. So that's our today challenge, is that we need to train people to meet jobs that are in high demand today and really are going to power our economic growth today and to make us more recession-proof in the future. The second, again, kind of challenge that we're trying to go through, as I'm going to walk you through these three elements, is how do we restructure our workforce development system so that we are attracting the jobs and creating the jobs that we want New Yorkers to have. Really those kind of middle skill, high skill jobs that will lead to tremendous impacts for not only the individual who goes through the training programs, but their families and their communities as well. So what are the three ways that we're going to tackle this kind of set of challenges? Today's huge job demand, as well as a changing employment picture of the future. It's going to be through three main elements that Governor Cuomo announced last year in his 2018 State of the State. The first, which is the easiest for me to talk about, is the new and first, which is me, Director of Workforce Development for New York State. And I'm building a new office of workforce development that is housed in the governor's office. So as I have been in state government, I have to admit, for about 8 or 9 weeks, and I'm already a little lost in the kind of alphabet soup of agencies. And what I found is that there is workforce development in almost every state agency. The DMV has job training programs, let alone the Department of Health, our Office of Children and Family Services, and then some of those that you'd think of, the Department of Labor, Empire State Development. So we have a tremendous set of resources across the state, but we really need one way to kind of pull them together to meet not only those immediate needs that we have today, but also, again, to think about strategically, how do we want to take on this changing employment picture of the future? So now we're doing that through the new Office of Workforce Development, which I am now putting together and leading. The second element, which is what I'll spend most of the time talking about today, is a new consolidated funding approach for workforce development. So Governor Cuomo announced a $175 million workforce development initiative that pulls together new as well existing funding resources to really make a historic investment into what we now see as an incredibly important issue, particularly for those jobs that are open today. So we've pulled together 14 different programs from multiple state agencies. And the kind of joke that I've been saying as I've been going around the state is that in the past, it's almost that you need to not only be a workforce development expert to really access state funding or state resources for workforce development, but in some ways you really need to be an expert on New York State bureaucracy as well. So you need to know all those agencies and their acronyms, the programs they have, what are the program deadlines, what are the underlying requirements. And what we're trying to do, particularly at this time of 3.9% unemployment, is dramatically reduce the barriers to entry so that individuals and organizations can really have more creative ways and more kind of direct ways of accessing state support. So that's this new $175 million process, which has no deadlines, which is incredibly important because we want to focus on what's the need, how are we kind of flexibly and nimbly addressing the need as opposed to kind of what the underlying restrictions are. And we have one website that you can access all of this at as well, which is ny.gov/workforce development. And don't worry, I'll probably say it a few more times, as I always know people kind of furiously try to write this down. I'll say it again. We'll have it on the screen as well. But it's ny.gov/workforce development. So again, instead of needing to know which agency, what's the deadline, what's the program, come to this one website and we will help you navigate kind of how to make sure that good proposals that are trying to train people for the workforce of today kind of get the state support needed so we can all as a state have additive kind of impact from that work and our efforts. The third kind of component, which is something I don't talk a lot about, but I do think is probably among the most interesting of this workforce development initiative that Governor Cuomo announced, is really a major investment and focus on data. So that means data in a few different ways. One is on the actual labor employment side. So as many of you kind of may have seen, it's probably, I shouldn't say many of you have probably actually accessed, but some of us who are workforce development nerds have a tremendous access to Department of Labor data, to university data, to kind of private sector data. But this data sometimes can tell us a little bit of a different story about what the economic needs are that we're facing. And so what we're trying to do is really take statewide an innovative approach that Monroe Community College has put together, which is within the SUNY system, to bring together these different sources of data, really kind of do not just first level analysis, but second and third level analysis to give us that more complete picture of what our job needs, what are our job needs, and what's actually causing those job needs. Is it that we're seeing job growth in healthcare because the sector is growing, because New York is particularly competitive in healthcare? Or is it because, in fact, when you look a few levels down into the data, that a lot of the healthcare jobs are maybe kind of low wage, high churn jobs? So the reason why we see a lot of openings is because people, as soon as they can go to something else, they do. So is that where we should be spending our state resources versus some of those, again, kind of middle scale to high skill jobs? So that's something that we're really trying to focus on, is data on the labor market side. What is the actual employment picture and demand picture look like? And how can that really drive decisions for us as a state? The other piece of data that we're also really looking at is performance. So training programs, as you may be aware, kind of range significantly in terms of their structure and in terms of their intended outcomes. And what we're trying to do through this new consolidated funding process, as well as bringing in these data sources in a really comprehensive way, is to think about how do we actually have more common metrics across state agencies in the industry as a whole, to think about how are we ensuring that ultimately ultimately an individual has an improved status quo has improved their status quo through going through a training program. And what are truly those skills and impacts that we want to deliver for individuals, so we are making sure their time is well spent when they're going through a state-funded workforce development program, which can include universities as well, and ensuring ultimately that those jobs are tied, again, back to the real labor market needs. So we want to be training people to improve what their employment outcome is and ensure, of course, that that employment outcome is related to an area of growth and focus for the state. So that's something that we're going to be talking about a lot over the coming months, is really how are we integrating data to make sure that we're not just preparing workers for the workforce demands we have today, but also thinking strategically about what that future of employment looks like. So with that kind of overview of those three components, I'm now going to do a bit of a deep dive into that $175 million kind of funding investment that the governor has made. Because not only do I think that's where a lot of you are most interested, but I also think is a place where we can really start to drive some of the innovation and change that we want to see in the near term in our workforce development system. So again, we have one access point for these 14 different programs, which is at ny.gov/workforce development. Again, a rolling process because we want to make sure we're nimbly focused on what the demands of the economy are. And really what we're doing through this new process is consolidating not only these programs, but tying them more centrally to our economic development agenda for the state as well. And how are we doing that in practice? How we're doing that is by utilizing the regional economic development councils, which are now about to start their 9th round of determining where economic development funding goes across the state, and really kind of utilizing these REDCs, is what we call them for short, to really make sure that as a workforce development proposal comes in, that the REDCs have an ability to have input on the process and to ensure that ultimately we're funding proposals that are in line with what a region's economic development plan is. So we don't want to have a workforce development system that is separate from our economic development system. We want to have them be integrated because we know that workforce is central to economic success. And the way we're doing that is through having the REDCs be a part of reviewing these proposals, which is pretty exciting and I think pretty unique across the country as well. So it's something that we're very excited to really bring these together so that, again, we're not just being strategic on workforce, but workforce within the context of the economy. So ultimately, as we're taking a look at these proposals, what are the REDCs and ultimately those in state government who are charged with dispensing these funds going to be looking for? There's a few different things. One is, again, tied to an economic development plan and agenda to make sure that we're not multiple systems. We are one kind of cohesive system focused on outcomes that can be additive to each other. We are looking for partnership, particularly private sector and employment partnership if it's from the nonprofit sector, because we want to make sure we're training people for jobs that exist today. So not jobs that existed 5 years ago or jobs that may exist 5 or 10 years in the future. We have, as Jim had mentioned earlier, 300,000 unfilled jobs today. How are we making sure that we're engaging those employer partners to address their needs today? So we're trying to make this go from theory to actually really addressing a challenge that we know exists across the state. We're also, again, going to be focused on performance targets. How are we ensuring that applicants are really articulating what the additive approach is that they're going to take with their programs? And how are we going to measure on the back end that individuals do, in fact, have improvements to what their life pre the training program was? So we'll be looking for increased wages. We'll be looking for kind of moving people from underemployment to full-time employment, moving people up in their career pathways as well. Those are kind of defined metrics that we are asking each applicant to really make sure they focus on. And then finally, there's something that I'm going to talk about a little more in depth later, but I do think is important, which is that, so we face again, and this is why I kind of started with the twin picture of employment to start with, not only how are we training people for the jobs that exist today, but also how are we starting to make those investments that will make sure that as the economy does continue its shift, automation isn't just in the future, it's happening now, AI is happening now, the gig economy is taking a greater and greater portion of our jobs today. How are we making those investments to make our system more flexible flexible and adaptable. And really ensuring that this, again, is kind of moving from theory to implementation, where we'll be asking applicants who are thinking of those kind of broader, more kind of long-term projects to also be very specific in terms of what their goal outcomes are and making sure they're tied to real challenges that we're facing in each regional economy. So now I'm going to walk us through kind of what are the three components of this new consolidated funding application. What are the kind of three areas that we really want to ensure that proposals are more substantively focused on? So I've spent a lot of time talking about the process a little bit. Now we're going to talk about the substance, which I always like to hold to the end because it's the most interesting. And hopefully we kind of can have a dialogue after I'm done speaking as well. So we have three different groupings of funds within this initiative. The first group is really what we're focused on within our SUNY and CUNY system, which are, of course, central to workforce development in New York State. We've brought in a number of programs that really focus on how do we build those employer partnerships and ensure that, again, individuals are being trained for jobs that do exist today, and that we're ensuring that these training programs are leading to additive impacts. So among the programs we have within this kind of funding stream are one, capital funding to really ensure that we have more experiential learning that's available to students on site at CUNY and SUNY colleges. So last Thursday, I was at SUNY Orange, the Newburgh campus. And of course, as I was wandering to find what room I was supposed to be speaking in, I found myself in a nursing lab. And then across the hall, there was another nursing lab. They looked very different from each other, which was great because it shows you kind of the complexity of what today's nursing kind of jobs look like. And so making sure that we're tailoring what our existing kind of campus structure looks like to what the actual jobs look like is key through this kind of funding component. In addition, we've also brought in other programs that work more informally with employers to ensure that we're ultimately training people, again, for jobs that exist today within the communities in which the SUNY and CUNY campuses are located in. So we have programs to work with employers on developing customized curriculum to make sure that we are, again, kind of training people for what is in demand today. We also have a component, which I didn't know about as somebody who's been in state government for all of 8 or 9 weeks, which is that businesses can actually work with their local SUNY and community colleges to develop programs specific for their employees, to upskill their employees to meet kind of changing industry trends. So let's say there's a new technology that your business is starting to integrate. There's a new sector that your industry is starting to move into. How do we make sure that your existing employees can respond to that changing market is actually something that SUNY and CUNY can partner with individual businesses on to create custom workshops, which I think is a pretty exciting way to make sure that we have living and breathing CUNY and SUNY programs and systems. And then finally, something that the governor speaks a lot about and is a major focus of ours is the apprenticeship program, and really making sure that we have more entryways for people into registered apprenticeship programs, which really do have tremendous outcomes, not only within the state, but around the country. We're making key investments through our SUNY and CUNY community colleges to make sure that we're ultimately tying people who are in degree programs to paid apprenticeships that can ensure that they have fulfilling careers. And so that's a very exciting component as well that brings in employers, brings in a lot of different partners to meet our real-term economic needs. The second component of funding that we have within this program pulls from a few different state agencies, and again is focused on what are those skills that employers are looking for today, and how do we take today's workforce of New Yorkers to meet those needs. So that can range from taking individuals who are currently unemployed to develop the skill sets that they may need to get their first entry-level employment, or it can mean how do we take incumbent workers and continue to invest in upskilling them to not only have them move up in their careers, but also to make sure that we can address those growing demands that we have in particularly certain segments of our economy for middle and high skill wages. And so this is something that, again, really tries to make sure that those applicants are tied to what the needs of employers are and making sure that we're articulating how are we addressing a real-term need that exists today. And then finally, this is where I usually like to end because it has the most boring title, which is Workforce Solutions. So it sounds pretty boring, pretty bland, but it's actually our most exciting portion of funding. So I spent a lot of time talking about the economic needs that we have today. This is where we can start to think a little bit more innovatively about not only addressing today's workforce needs, but those future workforce needs. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one thing that we're also trying to do, because we know that we have a changing economic system, even at a time of tremendous kind of job growth and demand, is really make those investments that focus on what's the economy that we want New York State to have in the future, and what are the types of workers that we want to be located in New York State. And so as I kind of tour the state, and kind of I'm sure some of my economic development colleagues don't appreciate when I make this statement, but I feel like often what we do in economic development is try to spend a lot of time predicting the future. So is it going to be healthcare? Is it going to be manufacturing? Is it going to be IT? But maybe instead of what we should be doing is trying to make these kind of sectoral bets from an economic and workforce development perspective, is really make those actual investments into making sure no matter where the economy goes, that we have the nimbleness and flexibility within our workforce development system to adapt to whatever happens. So it doesn't matter if ultimately it is healthcare or if it is IT, if we have a workforce development system that actually can incorporate employer feedback quickly and kind of develop customized curricula to make sure we're meeting those needs. And so that's something that as we're kind of putting this program together, speaking to businesses across the state, universities, nonprofits, we're asking them to make those really kind of important self-reflections about what is it that in hindsight I had a program and it didn't work? Why didn't it work? Let's actually try to get a little bit deeper to how we make our system structurally able to address our economic needs no matter what they are, because unfortunately humans are not particularly great at predicting the future. So how can we actually take our lessons learned to really make those investments that will make us flexible and nimble? And then I do want to say, though, that even again, and I mentioned this earlier, I've noticed when you do talk about something that's new, it's good to have repetition. So that's why I do a lot of repetition when I've been speaking about this across the state, is that even with this innovative funding bucket, though, we're not talking about research and development. We're not talking about things that won't have outcomes. We really are still looking to ensure that we have defined performance metrics and that we have a real clarity of purpose with what we're trying to fund and what the intended outcome is. So even if you're trying to innovate and do something that's new, let's be very purposeful to know if it doesn't work out, why didn't it work out? So we can make sure we can continue to adapt and learn as a system moving forward. And so with that, I will stop at the questions, which I was told to go back to the screen. So I'm very proud of myself for having figured out the clicker system. So we will, yes, right? If I can do that, which I usually fail at, that's usually a good sign. So with that, I will pause and we will try to collect your questions.
First of all, let's give Madhuri a big round of applause. I will be honest with you, I messed up. I did not tell everybody to write their question on the index card that they received today. So we're going to do this live. And if anybody gives you any trouble, you just tell me to step in, and I don't know what I'm going to do. You have to answer the question anyway. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions, not for me. So if you want to come back up, the floor is yours.
Being thrown to the wolves.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Hi. Yep, and if you could say where you're from or your name, where you're from.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. My name is Elma Borchilla. I'm with the Commission on Independent Colleges, QQ, as some of us know.
Ah, great.
I think we're meeting next week, which I'm very excited about. So I just want to say thank you for doing this. And part of it is we've been really working over the last year to work with, if it's our state partners, if it's Melinda over at NIATEP, and Trilly in the governor's office to really understand how we at independent colleges, not-for-profit colleges, can better facilitate either if it's the retraining or if it's the training of the new workforce that's coming through, our pipeline. So I'm very curious and excited to hear a little bit more about how you envision universities partnering with you all, whether it's through, the funding applications, but really more so I'm excited to kind of hear from you about what we can do. As a member organization, we're more than willing to help facilitate conversation and partnership with our members. I'd love to hear about what we can do to help as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I'm so glad that the first question did come from somebody in the university system because it is central to workforce development. And I think that's where we often sometimes have this struggle between kind of formal education, workforce development. But from my mind, and it is one kind of process, one system, and we are in this together, particularly, as you know, because why most individuals, if not all individuals, seek education, higher education, is to ensure that they have strong employment outcomes. And so I think there is no end to what we can do together, because it is, in fact, the same challenge that we're trying to face. But let me be a little bit more specific. Again, as I think about those kind of twin challenges that we face as an economy today, I think there are two things I'd love to work with you on, which is similar to what I would say, honestly, to a nonprofit training provider, a union, and a business, which is that let's make sure that we have a very strong feedback loop between our programs and the people that ultimately employ the students who come out of those programs. So really employers. So how are we learning from employers of whether or not our programs are truly meeting their needs and what their future anticipated needs are? So let me give you an example. I was at this great nonprofit training provider, Perscolis, which is Bronx-based. They have a Brooklyn location, a few weeks ago with the lieutenant governor. And we were speaking to some of the students there. And one student had said, we were asking about their backgrounds. And she has a 4-year degree in computer science, and she could not find a job because what she learned in school was not relevant to what employers were looking for. She went to a great university. She has a 4-year degree in computer science. So it wasn't like electrical engineer, it's computer science, and she couldn't find a job, and she had to go to a nonprofit training provider to get those realistic skills. That seems insane to me. So let's how do we figure out what employers are looking for, and how do we make sure, again, our programs are training people for those programs? And again, it doesn't need to be an either or, where we're just trying to kind of spit out people to be widgets for what current employers want. We can do that within a grounded system of education and kind of further skill enhancement, but it should be doing both. Otherwise, I fear we've kind of missed an opportunity. And then the second thing I would ask is that as we think about, again, almost where the structure of employment is moving forward, those kind of middle and high skill jobs and ultimately skills that we want people to have, how can we think creatively about ensuring that we're training more people with that basic skill set, so that's not just kind of training people for one profession, one occupation, but really from a university perspective, what are those core critical thinking skills and engagement skills that will take people across multiple industries to entrepreneurship, kind of to whatever their career may outlie, but let's think very seriously about that as well. So.
Thank you. I really appreciated your talk. My name is Cynthia Proctor. I work for SUNY System Administration. And I wanted to build on our colleague's last question and just make you aware of something fairly new that SUNY is doing. We've launched a micro-credential program, which are smaller chunks of curriculum that have value on their own, could be used to help a recent grad learn more about the newest developments in technology, but also could serve as pathways to an initial degree or an advanced degree for New Yorkers who have some or little college education. I think it's a program that has tremendous potential, but there are some roadblocks in terms of financial aid for shorter pieces of curriculum or alternative credentials, even if they are stackable to degrees. But I think that micro-credentials could be a tremendous resource to you in your work. So I'd love to see if there are ways that we can build those into some of the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to connect with you after. I'm actually heading to SUNY right after this, and I'm meeting with Dr. Johnson tomorrow. So let's definitely connect. 'Cause I do think over time, as we think about training, I know this is kind of a bit lame to say, but we really are kind of looking at lifetime learning is what is going to be central to what workforce development is in the future. So making investments in those types of micro-credentialing, because we know that people aren't just going to be trained and then go on with their careers every 5 years, every 10 years. People are going to have to come back and get trained again. So figuring out how do we create those kind of portable systems that can layer onto a more fundamental skill set is key.
What role do you see?
And your name and your organization.
I'm Marjorie Geiger, and I'm with a small not-for-profit that does workforce development with hard-to-reach young people. What role do you see, if any, for opportunities under this new grant for not-for-profits, either in a partnership or a standalone applicant? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great question. I mean, nonprofit training providers are absolutely a core component of workforce development, particularly in for certain parts of our economy, as well as certain regions in the state that may not have access to kind of other types of training programs. And so as I think about kind of the different sets of program funds that I laid out earlier, what we are really looking for is are two things. One is outcomes. So I think as all of you, and this is Albany, kind of know Governor Cuomo, have seen Governor Cuomo, he wants to ensure that we are investing our public funds to have the highest kind of outcome and impact as possible, which really is ensuring that individuals who go through trainings are ultimately placed in jobs. So that is number one, is kind of outcomes. But then I think of why do we talk about partnerships so much, and why did I talk about partnerships a lot, is because in order to get those outcomes, we really need to make sure that we're focused on what are those kind of critical parts of the system that will ensure an individual does ultimately have an improvement to their status quo. Again, whether it's wages, moving up in their careers, having access to more sustainable employment. An employer partnership is absolutely key there. And I think that's not only for private sector employers, but nonprofit and government employers as well. And so there are many ways in which nonprofit training providers can absolutely access and participate in this $175 million initiative. What we're looking for is outcomes, and really how do you get to outcomes? Partnership, to make sure you're kind of not just doing things in a vacuum, but kind of engaging the core components, particularly employers, into that solution building. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Camilla Campisi with the State Office for New Americans, and we're excited to hear you mention immigrants and different communities that might benefit from this. And we have a great network of partners that we work with who provide trainings and information. So I'm just curious maybe about communication and getting the word out once these programs are up and running. How do we get other state agencies to promote this with their communities? How do we get our immigrant partners to get involved and so their communities can benefit?
Oh, that's great. And it's almost like I paid you to ask this question, because that's certainly what I've been trying to do now in my first few weeks on the job, is kind of work with state agencies to ensure that we're kind of we have one voice to spread the word about this new initiative. And so what I would love, there are a few things I can just say here, but we should connect afterwards, is one, absolutely promote the new website, ny.gov/workforce development. We'd be happy to provide presentation and kind of program materials to you, any members of your team. The Department of Labor, Empire State Development, NYSERDA are all starting to do this, so we'd love to engage you in this as well, and really are hoping through this new Office of Workforce Development and kind of coordinating state agencies that we are able to speak as one voice as government to those around the state. Yeah, now I'm getting nervous. I'm walking away.
Hi, Jim Alatris, longtime listener, first-time caller. My question, this is, being in state government at one point, now being in higher education, we've always talked about workforce development. We always have programs and programs Cindy talked about. We have QQ and others. But largely, this is a cultural shift in many levels for many of our institutional partners. Mm-hmm. How do we ensure that? The city was talking about micro credentials and then upskilling you mentioned. Half of what we're doing now is our current structure of higher education almost doesn't fit our workforce needs any longer. So how do you ensure that we can change the giant oil tanker, which is our institutions, to sort of turn and say, you're not just getting a college degree for 4 years or a 2-year community college degree or a certification, and then you have a career in X industry for 30 years until you retire. It's changed dramatically. You have to constantly go back as skills. How do you do that as the workforce development czar in New York State to kind of get all of our institutions to shift their cultures about how we actually look at it in the process of actually giving out incentives and things like that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, I think, kind of two ways that I think about this. One is developing the proof points of what works, and really finding almost that kind of coalition of the willing among kind of our university partners in particular, who have been innovating, have been doing, whether it's micro-credentials, whether it's Monroe Community College adapting even the structure of some of their 2-year programs to kind of meet what they see as the best kind of value that an individual can get out of them. So how do we, one, identify what those successes are, and then kind of spread the word? Because often I think people can be willing and are willing to do something new, but they want to know that there's something there and it works and there's a benefit in for them. So I think it is kind of, again, almost identifying, incubating what are some of those programs that meet these kind of changing economic needs, spreading the word and kind of having adoption from there. Two is, and I think this is some of the point that you made earlier, Cindy, was kind of changing the structure of incentives we have ultimately. We can do, I think, a lot of change in our existing system, but a lot will require changes to our laws, right? And kind of changing of those actual incentives. And so I think it's kind of a twin balance that we have to do, is how do you make sure that what people are responding to today, those incentives change to what we need, but we're also providing them the guidance or what we're trying to incubate of what does that change actually look like, so we're not just innovating for innovating's sake, but really that it's grounded in kind of what has been proven to be successful. And I found across the state and kind of across the country as well, when you look at California, some other places that have had some tremendous, North Carolina, tremendous advancements to their community college system, we kind of know what works. It's almost kind of how do we build those proof points, spread it, and then change the incentives. So in short, we're going to be busy. The Office of Workforce Development is going to have a lot of work to do.
Hi, my name is Diane Hank, and I'm the Director of Workforce Transformation at the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities.
Great.
So love your presentation, and there's a lot we'd like to dig in to learn more about. But one of the slides at the bottom had a reference to, I think it was in the Pay for Success slide, and it talked about, or it referenced something about 6 months. So one of the issues that we have in our field, and this is in the nonprofit as well as the state side, is retention. The recruitment pipeline is also very difficult. But the retention is very, very challenging because it's a difficult job. The pay is not great. And so I just came from a presentation where I heard some statistics that I won't share because they'd be wrong, but a lot of people leave within the first year, okay, because it's tough during the traineeship. So I was wondering about that Pay for Success program, if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, because I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pay for Success is one of the newer elements that we've imported into this initiative, where we are really trying to focus on how do we invest in those programs that either we know work, that we need to spread more of, or two, that we have a sense that because of through a particularly tailored intervention are more likely to have the specific outcomes that we're looking for. And so that is among the way I think about that program in particular, which is only one of the 14 programs that are in this initiative. It almost has the most flexibility in terms of program design and in terms of program structure. It really is up to the applicant to determine what they want to do, but it is the most stringent on the back end of making sure that we ultimately are kind of funding programs that do have measurable long-term success. It may not work with every population, every type of job, but for those that we have a sense that it will, that these interventions are more likely to have those outcomes, that's what we want to fund through this Pay for Success initiative in particular. So that's almost where, again, it's one component, not, kind of there's 13 other components of this program that may affect other types of workforce needs, but this is really our focus on how do we shine a very bright spotlight on innovative design as long as it's tied to impact.
Hello, Madhuri. Mac Ratton, University at Albany, Director of Economic Development. I also am the co-chair of the Workforce Development Work Group for our Regional Council. So this is near and dear, this initiative. We just actually had Mike Lefebvre on Friday speaking to a group. Unfortunately, you could not attend. You're so busy, conflicted. But we had a wonderful session with over 140 industry partners present, just to show you, not that you need probably any ratification of how critical this issue is, but we only marketed this for 2 weeks, and we had 140 industry partners. My question piggybacks on the retention initiative. We often spend a lot of time of designing programs to be able to place, and we seem to think that the goal is ended when we placed the individual. And we know the retention issues are really critical, especially when we talk about some of the under-resourced populations that we want to serve with this funding. So I would encourage, I guess it's more, the question was posed earlier, I guess it's more of a plea that as we continue to look forward with this funding, that we look at programs that look at retention. In the capital region here, we have a great program that's actually run in the private sector by the City Mission of Schenectady called the Employer Resource Network, where employers are actually paying to fund success coaches who push on site and do barrier remediation. Do you envision there might be, more, either pay for success is expanded, or there might be opportunities where we can continue to look at some of these models, because that retention issue is going to be critical?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you spotlighted a program that I'm going to look up actually later today, because that sounds incredibly interesting. But I think that's correct in terms of pay for success. But we see some of that in some of the other programs as well, is thinking about also what's that kind of question of what we're training people for. So earlier I referenced that, unfortunately, in some cases we, and this is not just New York, kind of nationally, internationally, we'll spend a lot of time kind of training people for entry-level jobs that ultimately are not that good of a job. And so as soon as, again, somebody can no longer be a home healthcare aide, they will no longer be a home healthcare aide, right? So there's this twin challenge of, one, how do we ensure that we're training people for something that's going to lead to measurable success on the individual end? And two, also, what are those kind of jobs that really do have additional impacts across the economy that can be quantified, which are generally at that middle skill and higher skill range? So within this program, we are looking to, it's a little bit where we're almost trying to do everything, but be very clear within each program that we're trying to do something in particular. So Pay for Success is particularly focused on kind of retention, because we want to figure out what are those types of jobs that ultimately an individual wants to be in, that can be sustainable wage, can be, kind of truly more than just kind of a high churn entry level job. But there are other programs where we're specifically focused on populations that are a little bit harder to employ because of other challenges, whether it's historically long disengagement from the economy, individuals with disabilities, with mental health challenges, the formerly incarcerated. So I would say that Pay for Success is a great way to focus specifically on kind of the challenge and point you were just mentioning, but it may not be applicable to every population group that we want to train and get into the economy. But it is something that we have not had a lot of great success in, is kind of identifying what are those kind of more middle skill, high skill retention points that make sense. So let's make the investments there, is the theory.
I was wondering, what is the role of incubators? My favorite is the Tech Garden in Syracuse, in particular Hack Upstate. Every 3 months they hold something called Hack Upstate. Mm-hmm. They stay up 24 hours, they work with business coaches, they work with BAs, they work with people that provide equipment. They work with startups like STAE, S-T-A-E, to use real-time data for programs. The thing is I saw about 200 young men and women, an ethnically diverse population, enter that room, and then the next day come out forged as battle-hardened programmers. It was really remarkable. And I'm just wondering, is there any money for something like that that worked so well in 24 hours?
It's an interesting question. And I think it's something that, one, I'd encourage applications from anybody with any sort of intervention that they think has either past success or they think is likely to lead to future success. And I think I'd stop there. I mean, again, I think we're looking for programs that truly can change the employment outcomes for an individual. And we are very flexible in terms of what form of intervention that looks like, but we do want to make sure it is ultimately tied to something that is measurable and real. Instinctively, I hear 24 hours, and I'm like, I don't know if that truly can be transformative, but who knows, it might be. So I'd certainly encourage an application and one that really does focus on those kind of twin particular priorities we have, which are improved employment outcomes, which again can be wages, more sustainable employment, et cetera, and partnership, as partnership being a kind of key and proven metric of how do you reach the outcomes that we're looking for.
Thank you. This is Laura Gonzalez-Murphy with the Department of State as well, as I'm the Director of Immigration Policy and also with the Office for New Americans. And thank you for this presentation. It's been incredible. I wanted to check with you. I know you've only been here 9 weeks, but you seem to have quite a comprehensive understanding of everything going on in New York for the workforce development. So look, this question is really
I'm astounded by that statement, but thank you.
It was great. It was wonderful. And this question is really, is there a way we could collaborate and assist in the issue of credentialing? You've probably already been discussing it, and there's not enough time for it, but it's an issue that we see with the immigrant population, but also with the internal migration. You know, New York State relies on those high-skilled individuals or even individuals with middle skills whose skills can atrophy. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering about programs that would address that, credentialing for them, but even those that are coming and moving from California, from others that cannot practice here.
Yeah, I think generally the notion of how do we ensure that individuals have kind of pertinent and refreshed skills to meet today's economic needs is critical. And I think it's about us figuring out what are the most effective interventions, either because we kind of hear research about it, because we have applicants who are showing us in their application that they have kind of shown through results that certain interventions work. Maybe it's micro-credentials, but I think generally speaking, we are looking at not only kind of ensuring that individuals who've been traditionally marginalized from the economy are kind of getting into employment, but also upskilling really critically in a time when we have such tremendous low-wage job growth in the state. How are we upskilling individuals to meet those middle and high wage and high skill, ultimately, job needs?
Hi, I'm Cassandra Goddard from the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. So I just sort of wanted to follow up on that and ask if the state, when you're sort of looking at these applications and funding, is the state going to have any sort of requirements as part of the like funding applications for the programs to sort of address how they're going to, one, remove the barriers, but also support the people that maybe have been traditionally marginalized or don't have, you know, the abilities to maybe make it to work every day because of circumstances in their lives. Because that, obviously, in our line of work, impacts employment and long-term success.
That's a great question. And so great that I'm kind of regretting that I didn't speak about it a little bit earlier, which is that particularly at a time of historically low unemployment for many populations and in many parts of our state, individuals who are disconnected either fully or partly from employment are often because of underlying challenges that they face that are not related to employment but exist in their lives. And so some examples of that are, one, childcare. So Governor Cuomo has really made childcare and kind of childcare, high-quality childcare accessibility a focus, because we know that that is a barrier, an unfortunate barrier for too many caregivers, both women and men, to our economy. So particularly with some of the more flexible funding that we have within the initiative, we're encouraging individuals to think creatively about how do you couple training with addressing a barrier that otherwise has kept somebody from having kind of full-time sustainable employment. Childcare being one, transportation, of course, other types of wraparound services. So I think particularly individuals who have disabilities, individuals who are formerly incarcerated, have kind of other barriers that unfortunately are preventing them from kind of being full participants in our economy. And we are looking to make sure that we're not putting almost form over substance. Let's address those challenges. Let's be very clear, though, about what we're trying to address and what we think will lead to the outcomes that we want, which ultimately is better employment for New Yorkers. But absolutely, we're encouraging proposals to not be myopic and to really, again, that's where partnership is not just with employers, but with other types of organizations to ensure that individuals can get employment and then ultimately retain employment as well.
Hello, I'm Santiago Guerrero. I also work at SUNY System Administration. There I work with the information about the wages of the graduates of SUNY. So I was wondering, like, what do you consider, or what would your office consider, like a positive employment outcome for a graduate of any program? Like we struggle, like we know what are the wages are, but what would be a positive employment outcome?
So,
or some criteria that
so it's a great question, and it's something that as we're working with NIATEP, with Monroe Community College and other organizations, we're really trying to identify with more clarity what are the kind of types of wage jobs that we'll be focused on, as well as the types of skills, associated skills. For now, though, I would say for the purposes of at least this new $175 million initiative, we are looking for changes to, again, the status quo. It's almost that simple, where we're looking for wage improvements. We're looking for moving individuals from kind of higher churn occupations to more sustainable occupations, from underemployment to full employment. And I think over time, as we kind of calibrate and bring in more data, including kind of SUNY employment and wage data, we're going to have more clarity in terms of what kind of the specific outcomes are that we're going to promote. But for now, we're really trying to make sure it's almost step one, which is an advancement from, in many cases, the kind of past system, which is how do we document that programs will have a kind of beneficial and measurable impact through their interventions. Oh, okay.
Hi, sorry. Over. Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, basically. Thank you for the presentation. It's been really interesting. My name is Barry Murphy. I'm with the Office of the New York State Comptroller and a member of the Washington Ireland Program Class of 2019. My question surrounds CTE programs. So in middle schools and high schools here in the state, career technological education programs, what are the benefits of such programs, and what would you feel their role is in preparing and developing the New York State workforce?
Great question. CTE, or career and technical education, is just as education more broadly is really an important intervention for particularly younger people to kind of get exposure to our economy. And I think some of the ways that it's particularly beneficial are, one, CTE schools often have very strong employer partnerships. So an individual is getting a student is getting the opportunity to not only learn skills that are directly relevant to what employers are seeking, but to also get kind of on the job in work experience, which is, we found, from a data perspective, very helpful to ensure that an individual ultimately does get kind of access to a sustainable wage and kind of what we otherwise term a good job. I think that as we think about the overall system, CTE programs are, almost, they're a necessary kind of component, but can't be the only one. It's almost that this is something that, kind of Jim had referred to earlier as well, is that we're moving to a system where it's not just that you have one static training and then you're done for the rest of life. We need to make sure we almost have those opportunities at all points of an individual's career. So it's something that, as we think about micro-credentials or other ways of kind of employing our workforce, how do we take what we know has worked well with CTE, adapt it to other populations, other careers, and over the lifetime of an individual's kind of work life, I think could be very interesting. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa Montiel. You now have the trifecta of SUNY.
Oh my gosh.
Administration. I work a lot with our campuses on market analysis, labor market analysis. They're very aware, all of them are very aware of the need to link up their programs. You mentioned computer science, bachelor's in computer science. It is easier with community colleges. They are more flexible, and it's easier to change those programs more quickly with the state ed than it is for bachelor's degrees. So just keep that in mind. And Monroe also, they're a great example of what can be done. They also had a lot of funding to do that. That's not typical of our community colleges. So while I do appreciate the funding aspect of this, I would say any information that you can give universities and colleges of, they want to know where those jobs are going to be, what kind of curriculum, what are the employers. They don't necessarily have the staff to be able to do the kind of thing. So as part of your trial by fire and to be able to see information out there as opposed, not as opposed, but in addition to the money aspect that for the governor's initiative.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Though I will say it's interesting. I was in Rochester about 2 weeks ago, and one of the meetings I had was with the Monroe Community College team, and they actually raised this with me. Of people say we have so much money, but they're like, we didn't start with the money. We went out and found it once we kind of figured out what we thought was going to work. And so I think that you're absolutely right that funding is, of course, a major challenge for our workforce development system. I think that's where this historic investment, though, is important to make sure we can start to invest in what works and then change our system to kind of adapt to what works. But I also think that there's an element of, I think, near-term focus that we need to have, that if what we're doing is kind of missing the mark, then we need to kind of shift now. And it's taking existing resources and reprogramming it to places that, again, we kind of know what works. So that is something that we are absolutely focused on doing is let's identify what works, let's spread the word, and then let's start kind of shifting the system while hopefully at the same time ensuring that over time we're changing the incentives and resources behind the system. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
That was a great presentation. Let's give Madhuri one more big round of applause. Check in with us. We're going to be doing a lot of analysis here at Rockefeller. We're going to post this forum. It's live webcast now, but we'll also have it on our archives in case you want to watch again and again, which we like to do here for fun. We thank you for coming. This is probably the critical issue. We can't solve our economic development issues if we don't solve our workforce development issues. So we're very happy to have you at the helm, Madhuri, and we look forward to all the great things you do here 9 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks, and beyond into your job. So thank you very much for attending. We'll see you next time.